Today's story was sent in by a woman from Saigon. First, we'll begin with a chilling tale that happened to her seventh maternal aunt. This event took place over 30 years ago. Her maternal grandparents' house was located in Hamlet 7, Lei Min Zon Commune, Bin Chan District. Back then, her Aunt Seventh had just gotten married and moved to live with her husband's family in Hamlet 6. After about a year, her in-laws bought the couple a plot of land near Kaohsiung along the road leading to the lonely Buddha Pagoda. At the time, the area was desolate and remote, with dense forests and tall trees lining both sides of the road. The land they were given was quite spacious, and there was an old abandoned thatched house on it. Since they didn't have the money and weren't yet eligible by local beliefs to build a new house, the couple decided to clean up the old house and live there temporarily until they could afford to build something more proper. Although the house was run down after cleaning, it became tidy enough to live in. However, the area didn't have electricity back then, so they had to use oil lamps at night. During the first week, everything was completely normal. Every day, her husband would take her to work at a brick factory near her mother's home in Hamlet 7. Then he would go work as a construction laborer. In the afternoon, he'd come back and pick her up. But things began to change on the second night of the second week. That night, while they were asleep, she had left an oil lamp burning in the bedroom. At some point during the night, she rolled over and accidentally looked toward the doorway. Back then, their bedroom had no door or curtain since it was just the two of them living there. Suddenly, she saw two figures standing right at the entrance of the room. Because it was dark and she was still half asleep, she couldn't tell whether they were men or women, only that they were abnormally tall. Startled, she cried out in fear. Her scream woke her husband beside her. When he opened his eyes and looked toward the doorway, he saw the same two figures. Thinking it was a burglary, he quickly tried to get out of bed to confront them. But before he could even move, the two figures began walking straight toward them. As soon as the two figures stepped into the room, both the aunt and uncle were paralyzed, completely frozen, unable to move or make a sound. The two men slowly approached the bed, and it was only then that the couple saw their terrifying appearance clearly. They were both unnaturally tall, with thin, bony bodies, yet each of them had a bloated belly, swollen like that of a woman 7 or 8 months pregnant. Their faces were menacing. Their eyes, nose, and mouth appeared normal, but each had a pair of long, sharp fangs that curved downward, almost touching their necks. They wore no clothes, only a loincloth wrapped around their waists with a pattern that resembled tiger skin. Strangely, they walked like normal humans, their feet touching the ground. When they reached the bed, one of the men stood still, while the other lifted the mosquito net and climbed straight onto the bed. He spread his legs and then sat directly on the couple's stomachs, pressing down heavily. The pressure made it hard for them to breathe. They were suffocating, filled with dread. Then the man began to speak. In a deep, muttering voice, he asked, "Who gave you permission to live on this land? Who allowed you to stay here on my land? Why did you come here?" He sat there, mumbling to himself for a while. Then finally he stood up and said, "Let's see how long you two can last here." With that, he stepped off the bed. The two figures turned and slowly walked out of the room, vanishing into the night. And the moment they left, the aunt and uncle were suddenly able to move again. Terrified, the Aunt Seventh burst into tears. Her husband sat there in shock, deeply disturbed. He kept wondering who those two were, ghosts or some kind of spirits. He remembered hearing people say that ghosts usually float, their feet not touching the ground. But these two had walked like living people. The aunt insisted that they had to tell someone the next day to ask for advice or help. But after thinking it over, the uncle advised her to stay quiet. They had only been living there for less than 2 weeks. If they started talking about seeing ghosts, people might not believe them. Even worse, his mother, the one who bought them this land, was a very strict woman. If she heard something like this, she probably wouldn't believe it and would scold them harshly. Hearing his reasoning, the aunt reluctantly agreed. They both decided to keep the incident to themselves, and instead offer quiet prayers and small offerings, hoping for peace. The next morning, before going to work, the Aunt Seventh sincerely prayed, asking any spirits or unseen beings, if she had somehow offended them, to please forgive her and allow them to live peacefully on that land. After that, the couple went about their day as usual. And that day passed, without incident. That evening, while on her way to the market, the Aunt Seventh had an idea. She would cook extra food for dinner, so that they could reheat the leftovers for breakfast the next morning. It would be both convenient and economical. So she bought more ingredients than usual. That night after cooking, she left the remaining rice, soup, and savory dishes right in the pots, planning to reheat them early the next morning before heading to work. But the next morning, when she went down to the kitchen, she was shocked to find that not a single bit of food remained. The rice pot was completely empty, and the soup pot, stew, and stir-fry pans were all spotless. Most unsettling of all, not only was all the food gone, but the pots and pans were sparkling clean, as if someone had eaten everything and then washed them thoroughly. Baffled, she called her husband down and said, "Honey, this is so strange. I cooked a lot last night, planning to save it for breakfast. but now there's not a single bite left, and look, the pots are so clean it's like someone ate and then washed them. Her husband also found it odd. Since the kitchen was at the far end of the property right next to a wooded area, he guessed that a wild animal, maybe a wild boar, had come and eaten the food. He told her, "It's probably a forest animal. If you cook extra tonight, make sure to cover the pots properly, and maybe even place something heavy on top so it can't open the lids." That made sense, so the Aunt Seventh followed his suggestion. That night after dinner, they both went to bed as usual. But once again the same thing happened the next morning. All the food was gone, even though she had done exactly as her husband said, tightly covered the pots and placed a heavy piece of firewood on top of each one. She was completely baffled. If it had been a wild animal, it would have made some kind of noise trying to open the lids, but she hadn't heard a sound all night. The lids were still on, the pieces of firewood were still in place, but the food was gone, and once again the pots were perfectly clean. She called her husband again, this time with deep concern in her voice. The couple simply couldn't understand what was going on. Finally, the husband made a decision. "All right, tonight just cook like usual. I'll stay up late and keep watch. I have to find out what's taking the food. If it's an animal, I'll rebuild the fence tomorrow." That night after dinner, the Uncle Seventh hung an oil lamp in the back kitchen, preparing to keep watch. Around 2 a.m. he woke up quietly and made his way to the kitchen. He carefully lifted the lids of the pots and saw that all the food was still there. He then closed the lids again, placed the heavy firewood on top just like before, and hid himself behind a stack of firewood where he had a clear view of the entire kitchen. He waited for a long time, but nothing happened. Just as he was about to give up and go back to sleep at around 3 a.m., something suddenly happened. Out of nowhere a man appeared in the kitchen. The Uncle Seventh had no idea where this man had come from. He had simply materialized out of thin air. And when he got a clear look at the figure, he was so horrified that his entire body froze and he nearly fainted on the spot. The man was absolutely terrifying. He wore a tattered military-style pair of pants, shredded and torn like banana leaves, exposing his skeletal bony frame underneath. His face was sunken with hollow cheeks that revealed the sharp edges of his cheekbones, and on top of his head was a massive hole with flesh and skin hanging loosely around it. He also had 2 long, horrifying fangs sticking out of his mouth. Despite his thin frame, he was unnaturally tall. The man slowly approached the pots, lifted the lids, and began to devour the food using his bare hands, eating as if he were starving. When he was done, he stuck out a long, pitch-black tongue and licked the pots clean, leaving no trace of food behind. That explained why each morning the pots had been spotless, as though someone had washed them. After eating, he carefully placed the lids back, pressed the firewood down just as they were, and slowly walked toward the forest, disappearing into the darkness. The seventh uncle was so petrified that he remained frozen in the firewood pile, unable to move. He stayed like that until just before dawn, when he finally had the strength to stand up. He couldn't tell whether that being was human or ghost. Ghosts, as far as he knew, don't eat food. They only feed on scent or energy, not physical meals. So what kind of creature had he just witnessed? He kept asking himself. What was that thing? Its appearance was eerily similar to a zombie, a walking corpse, just like the ones he'd seen in American horror films. When he returned to the house, the seventh uncle thought to himself, "If I tell my wife what I saw, she'll be so terrified she won't even dare to go near the kitchen again." So he decided to keep everything to himself. That morning, when the seventh aunt came down to the kitchen and once again saw that all the food was gone, she immediately asked her husband if he had seen anything last night. He lied, saying that he had seen a wild boar sneaking in to eat the food. He added, "Tonight after cooking, just bring the leftovers into the main house. Put them on the table and cover them with a food dome. We'll lock the door. Whatever it was won't be able to get in." That night they did exactly as planned. After dinner, the seventh aunt brought the food inside, placed it on the table in the main room, and covered it with a food dome. Then the couple went to bed. The seventh uncle was certain that this time they would be safe. With the door locked tight, that demon wouldn't be able to get in. But sometime in the middle of the night, as they were sleeping, they were suddenly jolted awake by the sound of the food dome crashing and clattering in the main room. Startled, they rushed out to see what was happening. And there he was, the same grotesque figure the uncle had seen the night before, standing there lifting the dome and stuffing food into his mouth with his bare hands. Terrified, the seventh aunt hid behind her husband and asked, "Who's that?" in a trembling voice. Despite his fear, the uncle tried to stay calm. He stepped forward and demanded, "Who are you? Why are you in our house? Why are you eating our food?" The man kept eating, then growled back in a bitter, hateful voice, "I'm a demon. I've been here a long, long time. Why did you bring food into this house? Why didn't you leave it in the back for me? If you do this again, I'll kill you both. You dare live on my land?" Then he went right back to eating, shoveling rice and food into his mouth, one handful after another. The couple stood there, frozen in terror, unable to move, unable to look away. The seventh aunt watched in horror as he extended his long pitch-black tongue and licked every last bit of food from the pots and pans. After he was done, he slowly walked toward the back of the house. Just before stepping out, he turned to face them and snarled, "Let's see how long you two can last here." With that, he disappeared into the forest once again. When the seventh aunt heard her husband confess that he had seen the demon the night before but kept it a secret, her fear only deepened. That horrifying realization made it impossible for either of them to sleep. They lay awake in terror until dawn. The next morning they still went to work as usual. But that evening the seventh aunt didn't dare buy food to cook anymore. Instead, the couple decided to have dinner at her mother's house before coming home for the night. They figured, if there's no food in the house, that demon won't come anymore. But they were wrong. That night, after bathing and cleaning up, the couple locked every door tightly and went to bed. While they were sleeping soundly, they were suddenly jolted awake by a crushing, suffocating pressure on their chests. When they opened their eyes, they were horrified. The demon was inside their bedroom. He was using both hands to strangle them by the neck, his voice snarling with rage. Why didn't you cook for me today? Why, you let me starve? Why?" The couple couldn't fight back. Their eyes bulged as they gasped for air on the verge of passing out. After what felt like an eternity, the demon finally let go of their throats. Before leaving, he hissed once more, "Let's see how long you two can last here." Then he vanished. It was already past 1 a.m. The seventh aunt broke down sobbing, begging her husband to take her back to her mother's house right away. She couldn't endure it any longer. But the seventh uncle refused. He said the road back home was too dark and deserted, even more frightening than staying put. So the couple stayed up the rest of the night, clinging to each other in fear, waiting for morning. They had reached their limit. The next day, they finally decided to tell both sides of the family everything that had happened. Her maternal family believed them immediately. Her grandmother said the land was probably haunted, long claimed by some malevolent spirit. She suggested they either perform a proper offering ritual or bring in a spiritual master to investigate. But on the husband's side, the reaction was completely different. His mother and two sisters didn't believe a word. They accused the couple of making up ghost stories as an excuse to reject the land, especially Mrs. Ripent, the seventh aunt's mother-in-law, a woman known for her stubbornness. She lashed out at the couple, claiming, "You were given a big, spacious piece of land and now you're ungrateful, making up nonsense about ghosts just to force us to buy you a new one." The seventh aunt and uncle pleaded, with tears in their eyes, insisting that everything they said was true. They recounted the entire ordeal, from the first time they saw the two big-bellied men, to the terrifying visits from the demon who devoured their food and even strangled them in their sleep. They said they couldn't take it anymore. They were at their breaking point. Finally, Mrs. Ripent responded coldly, "Fine, you say all that and I still don't believe it. Tonight your two sisters and I will sleep there. Let's see if there really are any ghosts or demons." That evening, the youngest brother of the seventh uncle also insisted on coming along. He didn't believe in ghosts either. So in total, 4 people from the husband's side of the family went to the house, Mrs. Ripent and her 3 children. After having dinner elsewhere, the 6 of them returned to the house for the night. They divided sleeping areas. The seventh aunt and uncle slept in the bedroom as usual. Mrs. Ripent and her 2 daughters spread out mats and mosquito nets in the main room. The youngest brother set up a small mosquito net beside them. Around 10 p.m., just as the seventh aunt and uncle were asleep, they were suddenly startled by terrified screams from the front room. It was the voices of Mrs. Ripent and her 2 daughters. Shocked, the seventh aunt and uncle rushed out to see what had happened. But even after witnessing everything with her own eyes, Mrs. Ripent remained stubborn. She claimed it was nothing, that one of her daughters had a nightmare which startled her and caused her to scream too. She refused to let them speak the truth and ordered everyone back to sleep. The next morning everything seemed normal. But later the seventh aunt found out what really happened that night. All 3 of them, Mrs. Ripent and her daughters, had been held down in their sleep. When they opened their eyes, illuminated by the dim flickering oil lamp, they saw something terrifying. A massive black hairy hand as large as a tray was pressing down on the top of the mosquito net, crushing them and making it almost impossible to breathe. The next morning the 2 daughters begged their mother, saying brother and sister-in-law can't live in that house anymore. But Mrs. Ripent remained as stubborn as ever. She dismissed it all, saying it was just because they weren't used to sleeping in a new place. She scolded them for being cowards and even forced them to stay another night. The next night the same group stayed in the house. Mrs. Ripent, her 2 daughters, and her youngest son. That evening around 7 or 8 p.m., while everyone was sitting and chatting inside the house, they suddenly heard a whispering sound coming from outside. It was a low, eerie murmuring outside. Everyone turned to look toward the side window, which had a view of the yard. And then they saw something horrifying. Outside stood a bamboo fence, a fence that had never existed there before. But the most disturbing thing was that on each bamboo stake there was a human head impaled. The eyes on those heads were glowing bright red, and they were staring intensely into the house, their necks slowly swaying side to side as if still alive. Everyone except Mrs. Ripent screamed in terror. Then that horrifying fence lifted off the ground, slowly floated into the forest and disappeared without a trace. The seventh aunt couldn't take it anymore. She collapsed on the spot. The two younger siblings cried out, pleading with their mother, "Mom, what the hell was that? We can't stay here anymore." That was too real, but Mrs. Ripon remained stubborn. Even after witnessing everything with her own eyes, she refused to admit it. She snapped, "I didn't see anything, you're all imagining things, turning a chicken into a dragon." Then she said she would invite Hockey, the older sister of the seventh uncle, to come stay the next night. That night no one got a good night's sleep. They were all filled with anxiety and dread. The next morning the seventh aunt, her husband, and the two younger siblings refused to stay any longer. Only Mrs. Ripon, too proud to admit defeat, returned home and told Mr. Ripon that nothing had happened. Mr. Ripon, just as stubborn as his wife, also refused to believe any ghost stories. That night Mrs. Ripon, Mr. Ripon, and Hockey, the older sister of the seventh uncle, came to stay in the house. Hockey even brought along her 3-year-old son. According to Hockey's account, something terrifying happened that night. While sleeping, she was awakened by her son saying, "Mom, I need to pee." She picked him up and brought him to the front of the house. While he was peeing, she suddenly saw a horrifying sight. A massive hairy arm covered in thick fur like a gorilla's, but 3 to 4 times bigger, was flying toward them from the far end of the road, reaching out to grab her son by the neck. In that critical moment she acted quickly. She pulled open her son's shirt, revealing the small ivory Buddha pendant he wore around his neck. Then something miraculous happened. As the monstrous hand drew closer, the Buddha's face suddenly flashed a brilliant light like a laser beam, shining directly at the monstrous arm. Immediately, the hairy arm burst into smoke and vanished. Terrified, Hockey clutched her son tightly and ran back into the house. She did not sleep at all that night. The next morning, Hockey told Mr. and Mrs. Ripon everything that had happened the night before. She pleaded with them not being that stubborn, and that seventh aunt and uncle absolutely cannot stay in that place any longer. But Mr. and Mrs. Ripon still refused to listen. Their stubbornness was truly baffling. That night only the two of them stayed in the house. While lying in bed in the main room, they suddenly heard a strange rumbling noise on the roof. It sounded like someone was walking around, stepping across the thatched leaves, causing dry leaves to fall down inside the house. Mr. Ripon quickly ran outside to investigate, and then he saw something truly horrifying. All over the roof and on both sides of the house there were countless figures walking back and forth. The most chilling part, none of them had heads. They were headless, with only the body from the neck down. They wore clothing that resembled old Revolutionary soldiers, and their necks were wrapped in krama scarves. At this point Mr. Ripon, known for being fearless and cold-headed, still did not flinch. Instead he shouted at them, calling them, "You damn starving ghosts, all of you!" He cursed and challenged them, daring them to do something. Upon hearing his insults, the headless ghost suddenly formed a straight line. Then a voice echoed out of nowhere, "Let's see how long you two can last here." With that, the entire group marched like soldiers straight into the forest and vanished. Only then did Mrs. Ripon finally admit the truth. She turned to her husband and said, "Actually, I've been seeing things all along these past few nights, but I was too ashamed to admit it in front of our daughter-in-law. We can't live here anymore." But Mr. Ripon was still unwilling to back down. He said, "We just bought this land less than a month ago. There's no way we're giving it up." Then he added ominously, "I have a way to make those things never reincarnate again. I'll show them who they're messing with." No one knew where he got the idea from, but what he did next was something truly horrifying. Mr. Ripon had a horrifying plan. He prepared 6 buckets filled with filthy latrine water, scooped directly from the sewage pit. He believed that if those things dared to appear again, he would splash them with the disgusting water, hoping to curse their souls, making it impossible for them to reincarnate. And just as he expected, for the next 3 nights nothing happened. No strange noises, no apparitions, nothing. Feeling triumphant, Mr. Ripon told his wife, "See, you have to be tough with them. That's the only way they'll back off." But on the 4th night things started again. This time Mr. Ripon was fully prepared. When the figures returned, he ran out cursing and shouting and began splashing them with the foul water, one bucket after another. And strangely enough it seemed to work. Both he and Mrs. Ripon watched as the ghostly figures writhed in agony, then vanished into the darkness. That night Mr. Ripon was elated, proud of his victory. The next morning the couple returned home, but as soon as they arrived Mr. Ripon began to feel unwell. He climbed into bed complaining of exhaustion. Then just 5 minutes later his body started convulsing violently, like a catfish thrashing on land. He began screaming hysterically, "Help, someone help me, they're taking me, they're taking me." He thrashed in pain, screaming for help, while Mrs. Ripon stood nearby, unable to see anyone. Within minutes blood began pouring from his ears, nose, eyes, and mouth. And just like that Mr. Ripon died in agony in less than 15 minutes. After Mr. Ripon's gruesome death, no one dared to return to that cursed house. Seventh aunt and uncle abandoned everything, leaving all their belongings behind. They never came back. Only then did Mrs. Ripon finally confess that she had seen the spirits all along but had refused to speak up out of pride. But her torment wasn't over. Every night she began to hear the voice of her dead husband, begging and screaming for help, crying out in despair. Unable to bear it any longer, 2 to 3 weeks later, she went to find a Buddhist monk. When the monk was brought to the haunted land, he stepped inside the house, walked a single loop and then immediately turned back to leave. Mrs. Ripon chased after him, begging for answers. The monk looked her in the eye and said, "This land is cursed. Too many wandering souls dwell here. This land belongs to them. No living soul can stay here. Your husband, he wasn't supposed to die yet. But what he did brought great sin upon himself. That's why they came for him. Leave this place. Never return." Then the monk turned and walked away. After that, Mrs. Ripon fell into despair. She grew pale, frail, and gaunt, and just over a month after her husband's death, Mrs. Ripon passed away too.